In this video we're going to look at completing the LED circuit for your lamp project. This involves soldering in 9 LEDs and 3 resistors onto the green printed circuit board. So soldering is where we're going to use some solder and melt it to join all of the electrical components into the PCB. This then allows the electrical current to flow through all of the LEDs, through the resistors, and obviously then light up. Okay, so to complete this you need to collect one of the bags with all of the electrical components and make sure you've got your soldering iron plugged in so that it's heating up, ready for you to start soldering. First thing we're going to do is we're going to arrange all of our components into our circuit board ready to solder. So you need to empty them out of the bag, make sure they don't go flying all over the room. And the first thing we're going to look at is, if you see on this circuit board, you see there is a square shape around each of the LEDs and there is a slight cutout in each of the corners. Okay, that's there because that matches the shape of the LEDs. So they are a square shape and they have a slight cutout in the corners. So obviously that shape with the cutout needs to match the cutout on the green printed circuit board. So you simply line them up, press them in slightly. Same again, so line up that little cutout on the corner of the LED with the shape on the PCB and push them together. So you see, cutout there matches the cutout on the LED. You then need to do that for all of the 9 LEDs. Okay, once they're all arranged, just double check, make sure they're all in the correct position, because you don't want to solder them in place, because that's a lot of hassle to then remove the solder and move them. Once we've inserted all of the LEDs, we can then insert the resistors. So all these resistors are the same, so it doesn't matter which way round they go. Okay, but they obviously need to go in the R1, R2 and R3 part of the PCB, not into the power section. So you simply push one end into the hole, bend the other end round, push it into the hole like that, and then just gently push them down so it's flat, level with the PCB. You then need to repeat this with R2 and R3. Right, once all of our LED components and resistors have been inserted into the circuit board correctly, we can then grab one of these circuit board mounts, flip over our circuit board, okay, and just line it up with the holes and gently push it down, ready to solder. This stops it moving around so much and makes it a lot easier to solder. Before we can begin soldering our components, we need to make sure we've got our safety glasses on, because we don't want any molten bits of metal flying up and hitting us in the eye. We then need to prepare our soldering iron ready to solder. So to do this, we need to make sure the end is nice and clean. So make sure you've got a damp sponge and give it a little wipe. And before we begin soldering, we're going to do a process called tinning. And this is simply where you melt a bit of solder onto the end of the soldering iron, like so. You check that it's clean and it's ready to use. So melt a bit on, give it a little wipe, and then we can begin to solder. When soldering, it's important that you don't overheat the electrical components or the circuit board. So you only want to hold the soldering iron onto the parts for about 2 seconds each time. So you simply hold it on, 1, 2, and you can push on a bit of solder onto the joint. It's quick and as easy as that. Give it a little wipe each time, and you simply work your way around, 1, 2, 1, 2, and you work around all of the components, adding solder until you get a nice clean joint. Okay, so I'm not overheating them, just putting a little bit of solder on each one. Make sure your finger doesn't get too close to the soldering iron. So if you're soldering and your finger's getting a bit too close, just stop and slide your finger back up the solder to give yourselves plenty of room, because you don't want to burn yourself. Okay, you then work your way around, soldering all of the parts. You may find that some of the legs of the resistors are getting in the way, so once you've soldered them, you can simply clip them off using the wire snippers to make it a bit easier to access the other parts. If you find your piece of solder is getting too small and you can't safely do it without burning yourself, simply put that piece of solder in the bin and grab some more off the roll. You can simply unroll a bit, and you can just break it with your hand. Don't try and use tiny bits of solder, because we don't want you to burn yourself. Here's a close-up view of soldering, so you can see exactly how to apply the solder. So make sure the soldering iron is nice and clean. You simply place it in there and just gently push a bit of solder against it. Hold it in there for 1, 2, apply solder for 1, 2. 1, 2, 1, 2. Heat it up for 2, 1, 2, and apply solder for 2, 1, 2. Okay, so just continue to work along, heat it up, 1, 2, apply solder for 1, 2. Okay, once you've finished all of your soldering, remember you can trim the resistor wires because we don't need those. Just use the wire snippers. Okay, you can then pop it off the PCB mount and just double check your solders to check they're all nice and clean, there's no gaps in them and there's no big lumps of solder. So they all look good, so I can then look at putting this into the lamp now.